Hello everyone, welcome back from the coffee break. I hope you had some insightful sessions in the breakouts, and I got some good news for us. It seems like the poll that we tried to get to work this morning is now working. There's also bad news though, the Wi-Fi in this room in particular is not working very well. So for those of you who have the possibility to not use the Wi-Fi but use 3G, then do that. But let's just see what you actually answered to that one most pressing issue that you want advice or help with over the next 2 days. So apparently Sedex still pretty high up, but it seems like the modern slavery one is the top one. So do remember to use that little magic word, I will, to turn words into action. I think that's very important. And also be prepared to challenge, to talk, to participate. And I think one great way of doing that is, of course, to use Twitter. And since I couldn't be in all the sessions, I'm just going to have a little bit of a look on Twitter and see what some of you shared here and keep tweeting. So let's see here. We got one from the modern slavery session. It's Nora Walters, and she says, "Never stop learning and don't be afraid to get involved." A good lesson. There's one from the remediation session, and that's Jo Webb, and she says, "Good remediation equals good root cause analysis." So that's good. From the TEDx session, from the Sedex session, Dan Murray, he actually said there was so much new stuff going on in Sedex, so nobody could actually manage to pull that off in one tweet. And nobody did, so sorry about that. And the last tweet I want to share with you here today is from, let's see where it is. It's from Andrew Osborne, who says, "Message is interesting, but the IT sucks. Perhaps a self-fulfilling prophecy." So I think we're all kind of still struggling with technology. Good. Next up is somebody who's going to talk about Africa as an exciting, new and rising continent. And I know there's only kind of one speaker on stage, but I guess there's actually going to be 2 girls on stage. So please give Olivia Elliott a big round of applause.
Thank you, Thomas. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to just start off quickly by saying that the thoughts I'll share in the next 20 minutes are entirely my own and don't represent those of the Tanzanian government or my employer. So if you would like to tweet anything I say today, please do so, but only use my name. So yeah, as Thomas said, I'm Olivia Elliott, and for the past 6 years, I've been living and working in East Africa. I've worked along the cotton to clothing value chain, and I'm currently working as a consultant at the Textile Development Unit, a specialized unit within the Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment in Tanzania. In the next 20 minutes, I want to share with you 3 ideas for strengthening labor standards in sub-Saharan African countries. The ideas are drawn from Asia's long journey to industrialization. Many of you in the audience will be involved in sourcing from Asia. But as sub-Saharan African countries move from agricultural to manufacturing-based economies, you and others from industry might increasingly look to Africa. I hope the ideas I'll share today could prove useful in that context. But before getting into labour standards, it's worth just taking stock of Africa's position today. Governments across sub-Saharan Africa are putting industrialisation at the forefront of their agendas. And rightly so. In Tanzania, where I work, 70% of the population still live off the land in subsistence or near subsistence agriculture. But that's changing as urbanization driven by rural outmigration gathers speed. By 2050, Dar es Salaam, the commercial capital, will be one of the world's mega cities with a population of over 21 million people. That's 5 times today's total. Millions of people will arrive in African cities like Dar es Salaam looking for work. Industries from car assembly to apparel are looking at Africa with interest, particularly in light of the duty-free access to the US and European markets, attractive wage rates, improving power connectivity, and the spread of special economic zones with incentives for investors. In the last few years, the process of sourcing from the world's traditional established production sites has become more complicated. This is due to a number of factors, such as increasing wage levels across Asia, shifting foreign exchange rates, and changes in both retail trends and consumer behavior. As a result, Africa's frontier markets are emerging as potential alternatives for global firms looking to source products for their supply chains. As the Nobel Prize-winning economist W. Arthur Lewis suggested when he put the field of development economics on the map in the 60s, there comes a point where surpluses of labour in the subsistence sector are absorbed into the manufacturing economy, and so wages begin to rise. That turning point is China's position today, and I'd argue this creates an opening for Africa to take on part of the mantle that China and her Asian neighbours have held for most of my lifetime as the manufacturing engine of the world economy. The Emerging Markets Investment Bank, Renaissance Capital, recently found that East African countries, such as Kenya, are 55 years behind South Korea in per capita GDP terms, measured at purchasing power parity. In East Asia in 1960 and in East Africa last year, agriculture represented around 40% of the economy, while manufacturing and exports were small. Indeed, in the early 1960s, there was just one manufacturer assembling 3,000 vehicles in South Korea. Today, South Korea is a member of the OECD, the so-called Rich Countries Club, and boasts a formidable manufacturing sector. East Africa lags far behind. But what I want to highlight is that countries like Kenya are setting out on the same path, with Volkswagen just the latest investor to set up a Kenyan plant that can manufacture 5,000 vehicles a year. Sitting in the ministry in Dar es Salaam, it's natural to turn to countries in Asia and look with envy at the manufacturing sectors that have driven such rapid growth over the past 40 years or more. Take, for instance, Indonesia's vast footwear sector, Vietnam's burgeoning electrical goods hub, or the colossal Bangladeshi garment industry. By 2015, Asia and the Pacific contributed a third of the world's manufacturing value added. So, any takers for the proportion in sub-Saharan African countries? Now, I'm afraid we haven't got a Sedex app poll here. We're going to do it the old-fashioned way. So, can I have a show of hands, please, for anyone who thinks that it was A, 20%? No one. Or B, 12%? Okay. Or C, just 2%? Yes, you're all right. That's right, sub-Saharan Africa made up just 2% of the world's manufacturing. But should we look to emanate Asia's growth wholesale? The Asian growth miracle hasn't been without human consequences, and widening inequality threatens the sustainability of Asian growth. So in my mind, the question we really need to ask is, how can countries in sub-Saharan Africa replicate Asia's growth at the same time as protecting their workforces and upholding labour rights? Clearly, we don't want to wait for another disaster like Rana Plaza to happen. We want to create sustainable practices as part and parcel of a prosperous supply chain for businesses. So what have we learnt so far from Asia's rise? The first lesson I'd like to argue is that governments alone aren't always up to the job of protecting labour rights. Harvard's John Ruggie, author of the UN's Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, declares that states have an obligation to protect the fundamental freedoms of their workers. But practice shows us that governments in Asia, in fact across the developing world, rarely have the capacity to do so. Rana Plaza's collapse in Bangladesh was the result of fake building permits, rent-seeking officials, and an absolute lack of proper checks and balances, such as building codes, inspections, zoning, fire protection, and occupancy rules. 4 years on, almost to the day of the disaster, there have been some notable improvements. But in spite of the Bangladeshi government, not because of it. These issues are not exclusive to Bangladesh, but are common across emerging markets. Next door in India, for example, the Factories Act covers the areas of health, safety, and working hours. But the World Bank has reported that only a third of factories across all sectors have registered. Compliance is even poorer. Government inspectors are inadequately equipped to carry out their jobs. They have no budget for travel, so they can only visit factories if a company offers them a ride. The courts are also massively oversubscribed and therefore susceptible to corruption. A labour case, without paying off the right people, can easily take 10 years or more before a judgment. In short, there's a yawning gap between lofty government legislation and practical realities. Sadly, we have seen that time and again that states lack the capacity to develop strong institutions which are necessary to protect and enforce workers' rights. The situation in African countries is no different. That brings me to the second lesson. Voluntary agreements are not sufficient. Some major corporations have proven they are willing to take a firm stance when labour rights are not respected, like in 2014 in Phnom Penh, after the Cambodian police shot and killed 5 workers who were part of the workers' protest for a living wage. Clothing brands like Adidas, Gap, and H&M condemned the government. More recently, in February of this year, a number of leading brands like C&A and Zara withdrew from the Bangladeshi garment industry's annual showcase event after the arrest of 34 union leaders and the dismissal of 1,500 workers from their jobs, again following demands for higher wages. But is taking a firm stance enough? Ruggie's second guiding principle says that corporations should comply with all applicable laws and respect human rights, and that extends to all of their business relationships along their supply chains. Now, that's very nice in theory, but of course difficult to enforce in practice when global supply chains are ever more complex, crisscrossing national boundaries. The core problem with this principle is that it's not legally binding. The late Sir Bob Heppel, the anti-apartheid barrister and Mandela's legal advisor, once said, "Social rights are like paper tigers, fierce in appearance, but missing tooth and claw. We need to give them sharp teeth and claws." That means these principles need to be legally binding. In Bangladesh's garment industry, in the aftermath of the Rana Plaza collapse, 2 separate initiatives, the Accord and the Alliance, were formed. I think we can really learn from the distinction between the 2 of these. The initiatives mark the first time that competitors in the garment business have ever worked together on a supply chain problem. Both were set up to ensure proper factory inspections in clothing factories. The Alliance is made up of American brands like Gap, whereas the Accord mainly comprises of European brands like H&M and Tesco. The stark difference between the 2, however, is that the Accord is legally binding. The Alliance is not. That means that failure by a company to comply with the Accord's corrective action plans will lead to immediate termination of the factory. The Accord is also a multi-stakeholder agreement. It includes both local and global trade union bodies as signatories, giving them the same rights as brands on its steering committee. Worker representatives are also signatories on all Accord factories, and all Accord factories must have democratically elected health and safety committees to identify and act on health and safety risks. A manager at the Accord told me that any arbitration is backed up by the courts of the home country of the company in question. She said this ensures that companies must follow through on their commitment to make all their factories safe. To date, of the 1,700 factories covered by the Accord, 74% of health and safety issues have been fixed, whereas among the Alliance signatories, enforcement action is entirely in the hands of the brands. And should brands wish to walk away from the Alliance, they can do so at any moment. A Clean Clothes Campaign report published at the end of last year criticises the Alliance's lack of transparency. The Alliance does produce corrective action plans for each factory, but it does not produce updates on factory-by-factory progress. The report found that 62% of factories still lack viable fire escapes and do not have properly functioning fire alarm systems, and 47% have major uncorrected structural problems. Across all industries, from food to fashion and from beer to beauty products, there's an ocean of different standards, certifications, and agreements. The ones that matter, I'd argue, are those that are legally binding. Like we've already heard mention of, the UK's Modern Slavery Act, the California Transparency and Supply Chains Act, and France's Private Bill 501. The rest is largely noise. Plus, these laws should have real consequences for non-compliance. Like in France, where companies that fail to comply with the law can face financial penalties of up to 10 million euros. The third lesson I'd like to suggest we can take from Asia's development is that factories need continual monitoring and remediation that is both practical and immediate. Companies like Marks & Spencer's, across the 50 countries they source from, have for a long time required their suppliers to undergo annual third-party audits. M&S also have regional offices in all the key areas they source from, so that their local teams can visit the factories regularly and ensure their standards are upheld. And if not, rapid action is taken. Technology can help us here. For instance, innovative audit tools have begun capitalizing on the widespread access to mobile. In 2010, two innovative platforms, LabourLink, developed by the social enterprise Good World Solutions, and Labour Voices began crowdsourcing real-time data from workers from Turkey to Bangladesh via voice-based mobile surveys. Both platforms enable workers to call their systems free of charge whenever it is convenient and safe for them to do so, and provide feedback anonymously, enabling the most accurate and timely supplier data possible. The result is a continuous loop between workers and brands, allowing workers to report problems in the workplace and brands to help correct these issues before they escalate. M&S is using LabourLink to get contact directly with the workers on the ground in its supplier factories. In China, for example, through these mobile surveys, they're able to gather anonymous real-time compliance data around working conditions, hours, and pay. These simple mobile surveys are far-reaching and cost-effective. Once developed, the marginal cost for one country is effectively zero. M&S has already interviewed over 75,000 workers and can run audits multiple times a year. These tools provide a win-win-win situation for the buyer, the supplier, and the worker. The system highlights individuals' concerns and brings trends to the surface, meaning that early interventions can be made to resolve these issues before they become entrenched. So in summary, as African countries race to industrialize and attract investment from abroad, what advice can Asian countries share? First, governments across the world need some help in building strong institutions that protect workers' rights, allowing them to operate in safe environments. It needs to be a multi-stakeholder effort. That means bringing all actors to the table, the trade unions, private companies, and the government, right down to the local level, i.e. to the municipal governments that are responsible for implementing these laws. It's hard to emphasize how important this point is. Too often I've seen progressive laws introduced in a national parliament or a regional organization like the East African Community, only to gather dust because not enough effort was put in to sensitize and train stakeholders, including government officials, at the local level. Second, African countries don't need any more voluntary certification schemes or agreements. As industrialization spreads across the continent, I'd like to see the creation of legally binding commitments between the governments, suppliers, buyers, and unions to protect workers' rights. We need an accord similar to that in Bangladesh, making independent factory inspections part and parcel of doing business across all sectors in African countries. Without that, as industrialization gathers pace, there's a real danger that African countries could experience their own versions of the Rana Plaza tragedy. In the factories themselves, as in the Accord factories, another key requirement is health and safety committees to identify and act on workplace risks. There are emerging examples of these practices already on the continent. Take ADC in eastern Rwanda, the supplier to the American designer brand Kate Spade. ADC is an employee-owned company in which all workers are empowered to make decisions about the future of the factory. They have a democratically elected committee which discusses competitive salaries and benefits with the factory management. We need more examples like this. And finally, we should encourage the spread of innovative measurement tools like Labour Voices and LabourLink, which give real-time information to companies buying from these factories so that remediation is effective and immediate. These tools would be easily applicable in sub-Saharan African countries, where the mobile penetration is growing rapidly at 13% a year, with approximately 400 million mobile phone owners. So if African countries want to industrialize quickly, but also equitably, then as the manufacturing boom moves westward to Africa, global businesses sourcing from these countries need to apply these 3 lessons in a proactive, not reactive manner.